like it was, for example, in the case of the Romanian government adoption of the strategy in 2011? Or could it be the fact that key instruments for integration, such as microfinancing programs, remain a faraway dream for most of the Roma communities and individuals because, for example, inter alia, of the cruelly unnecessary bureaucracy, signing 620 times just to notify a project manager change is a cruel and unnecessary bureaucracy, or sometimes the huge 50% co-financing when we talk about vulnerable groups, even if it's an economic project, 50% it's huge, because if they really did have 50%, they wouldn't qualify as your target group in the first place. Or perhaps it is that the EU funding is addressing and is designed for Western Europe, and things have changed so rapidly that they didn't have the time to adapt their instruments to what is a truly uniquely situated population, and I'm speaking about the Roma, who face hardship on all aspects of life, which most of the other groups that were forming the object of the policies of the EU did not. Or perhaps it could be that the local authorities rather work against Roma than work for the Roma, and we've seen all too often situations when mayors put the Roma out of the villages or the towns, and we've seen all too often voluntary failing in investing in Roma communities by local authorities. Or could it be while these local authorities implement such policies, the national governments pose as prima donnas of Roma integration and look the other way? I don't know. I'm just saying. Discrimination and violence, it's truly something that we see in Roma communities in our daily work. It's something that we face again and again and again and again. And the wonderful panelists that we have this day will be able to show that in much more detail. I will say that the Roma are arguably the most discriminated group, the most discriminated against group in the whole Europe, by everyone. They are discriminated, be it by average citizens, by companies, by banks, by schools, by local authorities, all the way to Minister of Foreign Affairs, prime ministers, heads of state. They all did it, they all do it, and what's even worse is that they usually get away with it. And the distress for having done that is minimal, if it exists at all. And I will say that the current context is not really helping, because in Europe right now, acting and thinking and speaking as a racist, it's increasingly acceptable. And when your target group is the Roma, the target of your hate is the Roma, then that's even more the case so. It's even more increasingly the case so. The rule of law and democracy building are supposed to be continuous struggles. You really have to fight for them every day, or to protect them every day. And episodes like last summer in Romania with the political crisis we had, or the current situation for a few good years in Hungary, are just reminders of this issue. As we speak right now, in Romania, the electoral law in respect of national minorities is purely anti-democratic. So it goes against democracy, it promotes totalitarianism. In a diplomatic language, the OSCE has acknowledged that in their report in 2012 elections monitoring report. Roma face a lot of issues, from racist violence to racist killings, to police abuse, school segregation, discrimination in access to health, forced evictions, illegal limitations of their freedom of movement, These are just a few of the patterns that Roma are facing nowadays. And it must be said that the current EU legislation and the policies prove rather inefficient in fighting this. And when I say that, I also refer to the national policies, not only the EU, because the prime responsibility lies with the national governments. And the question is, why is that? And could it be? And I'm going to stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Marion, for that thought-provoking and very big picture set of questions that you've left us with. What I would suggest now is that everybody has a job to do. While the next panel are getting ready to come up, I'd invite all of you to read their bios since we're already running late, so I don't have to introduce them at length. And then we'll start the next session. I'm not going to take questions now after the framing concepts, but we will have an opportunity later for people to engage from the floor. So thank you very much to the opening speakers again, and look forward to discussing further. So could everybody please, the second panel, come and join Professor Sen on the podium? Thank you. And could all of you please just quickly review their impressive bios?
Professor Sen, you won't remember me, but I've been a student of yours at some point.
Where?
I'm going to might ask that.
Economics, the PhD, yes. Yes, yes. So it's nice to see you.
Hey.
Nice meeting you.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Roberta Gatti. Very nice to meet you. From Roma
How are you?
Good to see you.
One from Roma Rrights. Hi, Roberta. Nice to meet you. Nice to meet you.
Okay, everybody here, I'm sure, is a very quick reader. So let's try and start our second panel, or rather, our first panel, but the second set of contributions. So before I make my opening remarks, I wanted just to add to Professor Liening's welcome and say a little bit about the home team that's responsible for this event. Several mentions have already been made of our colleague Magda Amartya, and the fact is that without Magda there would not have been this conference. Magda is, as Marion just said, a remarkable person, an activist, a scholar, a dedicated and charismatic Roma intellectual who, for our good fortune, has spent or is spending the year at the FXB Center as a postdoctoral fellow. And her contribution to our thinking about Roma issues has been nothing short of epic, shall I say. She of course, has a lot of experience of working in this field, but she also has a strategic vision which is really invaluable, and many of the speakers, the illustrious speakers that we've managed to attract to today's event are directly a result of her contacts, of her credibility and her hard work. So Magda, thank you so much. Of course, no event like this for a small centre like ours happens just with the work of one person, however extraordinary. And I just want to briefly mention our other colleagues who've really worked very hard to get all of us together, produce the materials and organise what we hope will be an important contribution to advancing the discussion, at least, of Roma rights. Our Executive Director, Arlen Fuller, has been invaluable. As has Sarah Doherty, who is one of our research associates, and Bonnie Schneerson, who is our coordinator of public relations. So the three of them have, I think, been the right-hand people for Magda and are really responsible as well for bringing this together. So thank the three of you very much as well. I'd like to just make a couple of opening remarks briefly and then introduce one by one, very briefly, our distinguished panel. Romania is the European Union country with the highest number of Roma citizens, estimated at between 1.5 and 2 million. And in this country, only 61% of the adolescents over the age of 11 who are Roma are enrolled in school, compared to 91% of their non-Roma counterparts. The figures for high school and university attendance are even more skewed. Only 9% of Roma adolescents versus 41% of non-Roma are in high school, and only 2% of Roma, 2% versus 27% of non-Roma young people are in university. So I think this is particularly striking, given that we are sitting in a university. Add to this the unsurprising fact that teenage pregnancy is much higher among Roma girls, 55% versus 14% for non-Roma. And one sees a picture of the pervasive denial of access to fundamental components of the toolkit that a young person needs to survive and flourish in today's competitive and globalized economy. Now, of course, education is not a sufficient condition of social empowerment or of economic or personal success. As we note from the Arab Spring or the acute crisis facing adolescents and youth in many EU countries right now, school-leaving certificates and university degrees don't guarantee a good match with the skills required by employers, nor do they generate or stimulate the availability of rewarding and remunerative employment. But without education, without just access to education, without not just access to education, but sustained engagement in quality education. The possibilities of social empowerment and economic or personal success are much more remote. In our knowledge-based, fast-changing and globalizing society, education really is a necessary condition of future well-being. It's a necessary condition for the realization of rights, both of individuals and of the communities that they're members of. Now, education doesn't stand alone as a mechanism for social integration or for human security. It's linked inextricably to healthcare. Children with malaria or malnutrition or worms in their digestive systems cannot learn effectively, as we know. And of course, it's also linked to adequate shelter and housing. Children without a space to call their own, without a permanent and safe location to do their homework, can't flourish. And it's linked to the need for a safe environment if there's violence in the home or sexual or physical harassment, bullying on the way to school or in school. All of these things are critical anchors for a rights-respecting society. But most critically, perhaps, education depends on access to an environment that acknowledges and promotes a sense of common human dignity, of the inclusion, of the self-worth, of the high expectations of respect for the potential and value of each child. And that's why, I think, or one of the reasons why, over the last half century and more, discrimination within school, segregation, violence, abuse, neglect, exclusion have been such a huge target of human rights interventions. That's why it's been a critical issue, was a critical issue in the civil rights movement in the southern United States. That's why it's a critical issue in rural India. That's why it's a critical issue in sprawling metropolises of Latin American race. Europe had a head start on many of these initiatives. Race and sex discrimination have been, as Professor Greenberg points out in his masterful piece, which I'll refer to again in a minute, have been illegal as a matter of both domestic and regional law since the immediate post-war period. Public education systems have a long and deeply entrenched history in Europe. How is it then that despite this advantageous position, Europe remains home to some of the most egregious and manifest educational discrimination? How is it that today, to this day, member states of the European Union are complicit in situations where some minority communities are systematically excluded from quality education, where their access to and engagement in higher education is so sharply lower than that of their majority peers? How is it that teachers can get away with stigma and discrimination against some of their pupils across the board? This critical set of questions forms the context for our first panel of speakers. And I think I hardly need tell you how lucky we are to have a stellar crew, leaders in their fields, deep and engaged thinkers and actors who've made very significant contributions to knowledge and to the discussion we're engaging in. The format for today is as follows. I will very briefly introduce each speaker. Each speaker will be speaking for 10 minutes each, one after the other, and I will try and be a little bit ruthless. And then we will have a respondent. Our respondent here, my colleague Professor Lamont, will respond for 10 minutes. We'll briefly invite the colleagues on the panel to comment on each other if they want to, if they have anything particular to say, and then we will have Q&A from the floor, and I'll ask you to speak into a microphone. So that is the format. So let me start, first of all, by introducing our first speaker, Professor Amartya, who is, I think, in many ways, the founder of the field that we're working in, this field of the influence of education on social justice, the importance of the connections between education, health, shelter, dignity. I think it would be very difficult for any of us to think of the sorts of thoughts or conversation we are having now were not for the influence of Amartya Sen's work. So I'll say no more about him, but simply to say how deeply grateful we are, Amartya, that you joined us today. Thank you.
Speak now?
Yeah, speak now.
I'd first like to make clear, since I arrived before my time and sat down here, that it's not invariably the case that I do that. But that is also something which I want the Roma people to do, namely to occupy their seats a little earlier than it's offered to them. It's quite important to demand the rights and get them. I'm delighted that this meeting is taking place. I know the very hard work of Jacqueline, Bhabha, and others have gone into it. But of course also it fits in so much with, I've been privileged to have known the founders of the FXB system. One of them is here, actually, but Albina and others, and it fits in tremendously to that. And since I've also been privileged to chat with Magda, and I know how much was riding on this, so I'm absolutely delighted that we are all here. When I looked at the number of speakers and divided by the time available, it looks that we had about 29 seconds each. And you know, it's not that nothing could be said in 29 seconds, but it's quite hard. I think, let me begin by a couple of comments on human rights. Sometimes it's thought that human rights is a kind of entity which is a kind of legal base to it, which I don't think it should be seen as. That's the way that Jeremy Bentham tried to dismiss the claim of human rights, claiming that all rights are children of law, and therefore you couldn't have, without the law, you can't have any rights. Now, that of course was to undermine human rights altogether, because whatever law we happen to have depends on the nature of the society and what we decide to put into the law. It is something much greater, much larger than that. I think Herbert Hart argued that in a famous article in 1955, that essentially human rights are parents of law rather than child of law, that they motivate laws. But it became clear also in subsequent discussion, it's not just the law that helps to promote human rights. Quite often the law needs promotion by other things, by agitprop, by public discussion, public movement, and so on. You mentioned that in Europe these rights have been recognized from 1940s onward. Well, so it has been in the Indian Constitution, of course, which was the first constitution to include affirmative rights in 1949-50. And yet, you know, in the case of India, it's not so much the Roma, but the corresponding problems of discrimination haven't gone away just because the laws have been changed. So we need a much broader perspective in dealing with the issue of realizing Roma rights. We have to recognize that it's not so much as the language here says that we have to make the human rights into a kind of moral consensus. It's really it's really on the morality that the whole human rights concept really, I believe, draws. And there's nothing undermining in it to say that it's not legal, because if it were legal already, there wouldn't be much of a fight as far as legislation is concerned. One of the things, I think the three early presentations that we have in panel one, I got confused, by the way, because you said panel one when I came in, and I thought I was a member of panel one, so I marched immediately. But I've overlooked that there were panel 0. But despite being panel 0, they had said very interesting and very important things. And I would add to that, arising from some of the comments that were made, that changing the perception of what it is like to be a Roma is a very important feature of that, because there is a kind of established image of Romas, or to use the traditional term, gypsy lifestyle. And first of all, that's not the lifestyle of most people now anyway in that community. Secondly, even if it were, that requires a change, and that's for people to decide. So I think this way, you brought out, Jacqueline, strikingly some of the educational connection, the backwardness, 61% going to school as opposed to 91% of the rest, and a very low percentage of university education. So changing those images are very important, and people here, I mean, I'm privileged to know here Magda, I'm privileged to know Christiana Gregory, who are here, come from New York for this meeting. You know, that it's changing the intellectual creativity of the Roma is really extremely important. And I think it's also important to recognize, I think there are two aspects. One is that the disadvantage of this group lie in a combination of different features. There is the discrimination, there is the exclusion, and there is also economic poverty. And they go together, and I mean, it's also true, as we know from studies, for example, in India. It's a combination of caste and class, that if you come from low caste, then you have very low income. On top of that, if you happen to be a woman, and the three together could be quite difficult to get rid of in terms of as a barrier to progress. So I think we have to look at how these interactions work, rather than separate out that there's problem 1, problem 2, problem 3. They are a kind of integrated problem. The second thing is that it's very important to recognize that Romas are not only a disadvantaged group, but they have some real insights to offer for the future of the world, from which non-Romas could enormously benefit. For one thing, it has been a quintessentially a global community. They bring a global perspective to it. On linguistic grounds, it's often determined that they might have originated in India on grounds that the Roma language is closely connected with the Indo-European, and particularly the Sanskrit Sanskrit branch of that. So that might be, but then again, there's always great difficulty in linking ethnicity to language, and we know that that's a big problem. We don't know. But certainly there's no question that they've moved around, they have declared their home in just an astonishing variety of countries, and tried to make sense there without disrupting lifestyle there, but trying to find a place in the sun in each of these countries. So there is a kind of indomitable spirit of globalism that is part of the Roma identity. And I don't think we'll ever capture it if we continue to think of Roma simply as a disadvantaged group. I mean, they may be disadvantaged, but they also have an advantaged position to offer to the rest of the world. And nothing is so important in the moment today in the world as the understanding of a global perspective in dealing with any problem, whether we're dealing with terrorism, whether we are dealing with ethnic racial discrimination between black and white, the successors of apartheid, successors of casteism, the successors of racial discrimination of various kinds that take place in different parts of the world. The second thing on the positive side is that by the necessity of global existence, one of the major, in my judgment, very important insights, which is overlooked often, the fact that human beings have a multiple identity is not an option that the Romas ever had. They may be in Romania, so they have to have a Romanian identity because of the fact that that's where they live, and the local language, the connections, the heritage are all local. And yet there are important things that they want to preserve in the Roma culture. So that multiplicity of identity, which is often a kind of option, and people often overlook how the principal identity in the world has changed. When the First World War was being fought, the bloodiest of all possible wars between 1914 and 18, the principal identity was thought to be nationalism. The British and the Germans and the French were tearing each other apart. The fact that there was a religious diversity and religious unity, all of them were Christian, didn't make any difference, because that wasn't the thing to be emphasized. Just as today, in some contexts, when people are told that you're a Muslim or you're Hindu or a Christian, we must stand up for that. And then everything else is blotted out, and even nationalism doesn't matter. So the principal identity, a kind of all-engrossing presence of principal identity, has been really the biggest creator of violence in the world, probably, whether we look at the world wars or whether we are looking at that terrorism today, when we look at riots, whether it be fought in India yesterday in the 1940s, or in Burma today, between Buddhists and Muslims, or in Indonesia, or in other parts of the world. And it looks as if the religion divide is that's something you cannot transcend. On the other hand, the fact that you have to have multiple identities, they have to recognize that you have different ways of seeing yourself. And as the economic and social opportunities expand for Romas, they will have other identities to look at. Some Romas are university educated, others not. Some Romas will be in modern industries, others not. Some people might be in agriculture and so on. So I think all these issues make us interested in viewing Romas not just with sympathy, but also with admiration and a thirst for understanding the experience and what we have to learn from that. Now, this is a International Roma Day, and I think we should celebrate also the richness of perspective that they bring, not just the depth of discrimination and the suffering that the Romas suffer from. I would have loved to have spoken, but I think my 29 seconds are over now.
So. Thank you very much. Our second speaker is Professor Jack Greenberg from Columbia Law School. Professor Greenberg wrote, I think, one of the most seminal and influential articles comparing the history of struggle against racial discrimination in the US, which culminated, or partly culminated, in the Brown versus Board of Education Supreme Court case, comparing that to the history of struggle against anti-Roma discrimination in Europe. I think he did this at the invitation of various European organizations who asked for his expertise. He was himself involved as a counsel, as a lawyer in the Brown versus Board of Education case, arguing it in court. And so he really does span this enormously important period of history as an expert. And it's wonderful that having this long tradition of working on American civil rights issues, he then turned in this sort of latter part of his career to working intensely on Roma issues. And for anyone who hasn't read it and who's interested in this issue, I cannot recommend strongly enough his really magisterial article in the Columbia Law Journal making this comparison. Certainly I learned an enormous amount from it. He's now carrying on working on a range of Roma-related issues, and we really are delighted that he has agreed to come here and speak on our panel. So, Professor Greenberg, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for inviting me. I think I've learned a lot studying the Roma school desegregation issue, learned a lot about American desegregation, such as there has been. When the Supreme Court of the United States decided that racial segregation in schools no longer would meet the standards of the Equal Protection Clause of the American Constitution, it did not order that the schools desegregate immediately, as one might have expected. It said it should be done with, quote, all deliberate speed, a phrase that it did not define. There was the phrase that never been used on one sort of unimportant occasion in American or English jurisprudence earlier. And so we had to work out in time what all deliberate speed meant. It turned out that all deliberate speed was the deliberate, which means slow, and speed, which means fast. And the two created a paradox. And it was 15 years between 1954 and 1969 until there was the first meaningful desegregation in the southern part of the United States. In that 15 years, the country learned something, and what it learned was that the tradition of segregation was deep and very difficult to shake, and there was almost no desegregation. Where it was attempted, it was met with violence and resistance in the southern part of the United States, and then, in retrospect, not surprisingly, in such places as Boston right here, Boston was virtually in a state of revolution during the effort to desegregate the schools here with violence of all sorts, and the ultimate effort to desegregate the schools realized by formal compliance, but a considerable outflow of white children from the school system, at least in the public school system, and so there was no effective desegregation in Boston either. And that occurred in many other parts of the United States, much to the disappointment of those of us who fought for desegregation. Since then, parts of the country have thought better of what they've done in the past, and there's been some desegregation, but not a great deal of it. Politically, the country has changed considerably also. In parts of the country which had desegregated and then returned to segregation, we have instances of citizens groups in various cities and communities recognizing the desirability of desegregation and attempting to, by community and voluntary efforts, to desegregate the school systems, only to be frustrated by a Supreme Court which has turned conservatively, considerably conservative, and saying that the desegregation itself is a racial discrimination. The situation in the United States as early as 1940 led to the writing of a book called The American Dilemma by Gunnar Myrdal, which contributed to the Supreme Court coming to the conclusion that it did. And we take a look at Europe. Europe is, to a considerable extent, replicating what happened in the United States. It was not until about 10 years ago that European law recognized that segregation of Roma in schools violated a variety of commitments that the European community had made in the European Convention on Human Rights and other legally binding requirements. But then again, as in the United States, nothing was done. Finally, in about 10 years ago, it was about 10 years ago, the European European Court of Human Rights decided in the DH case in Czechoslovakia, that in the Czech Republic, that segregation in Czech schools violated the convention, and still nothing has happened. They have held conferences and had meetings and written definitions, and then held further conferences and scheduled other conferences, but has not desegregated. And ultimately, the United States enforced the school desegregation in places that were thoroughly recalcitrant, and President Eisenhower flew the Air Force into Little Rock, Arkansas, and they proceeded to desegregate their schools. But that was, in a sense, only a token response to the requirement. Ultimately, 9 black children entered the white schools, but it was a token and real commitment. And when James Meredith entered the University of Mississippi, after that, President Kennedy flew the Air Force to Mississippi, and James Meredith entered the University of Mississippi. There are different reactions to that. Little Rock High School is now mainly black, but the University of Mississippi has a large and robust black population. And James Meredith, who went through a gunfire in order to attend the school the first day, has had his son graduate with a PhD with honors from the University of Mississippi School of Business. So much depends upon local conditions and how the local